Good afternoon and welcome. On the behalf of Michael Taylor, the director of the museum, and the staff of the Hood Museum of Art, welcome to today's lecture. I am Kathy Hart, Senior Curator of Collections, and the Barbara C. and Harvey P. Harvey P. Hood 1918 Curator of Academic Programming here at the museum. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Hood Museum of Art for this lecture by Dr. Brendan Foley, which is being presented in conjunction with the exhibition Poseidon and the Sea, Myth, Cult, and Daily Life, which opens to the public tomorrow. But we have a treat for you tonight. We are pleased to tell you that after the lecture, you were invited up to the galleries to preview the exhibition. The galleries will remain open till 7 p.m. This exhibition was organized by the Tampa Museum of Art, and its presentation at the Hood has been generously supported by Claire Forster and Daniel S. Bernstein, class of 1987, and the Eleanor Smith Fund, the Evelyn A.J. Hall Fund, and the Marie Louise and Samuel R. Rosenthal Fund. We also have here this evening one of the lenders to the exhibition, Dr. Wally Gilbert, and we thank him for generously agreeing to part with his objects for the run of the show over 3 venues. Today's lecture has been co-sponsored by the Newcomb Institute, the Dartmouth Archaeology Working Group, and the Hood Museum of Art. I would like to thank our colleagues, in particular Dan Rockmore and Deb Nichols, for their support of this program, and to the members of the Art History and Classics departments for their advice about our programming in conjunction with this exhibition. Please also join us on January 30th and 31st for the official celebration of the exhibition and a half-day symposium. We also have a number of gallery talks that are being given by members of the faculty and staff, and please check our listings either in our quarterly calendar or online for those gallery talks. Dr. Seth Pevnick, who is curator of this exhibition, and will give the keynote address on January 30th, is currently the acting director, chief curator, and Richard E. Perry, curator of Greek and Roman art at the Tampa Museum of Art. We are very pleased that he's here this evening, and in fact, he's been here all week helping install the exhibition, and would like to take this opportunity to thank him for organizing this marvelous look into the image, myth, and cult of Poseidon and sharing it with the Dartmouth and Upper Valley communities with this showing at Dartmouth. It is especially meaningful to us as he's a Dartmouth graduate, class of 1999, and a former intern of the Hood Museum of Art. Thank you also to Dr. Foley for making the journey here on this cold January day to share with us his important archaeological work on the Antikythera Shipwreck. So Seth will introduce Dr. Foley. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy, and thank you all for coming. As a Dartmouth graduate, it is indeed very special for me to come back here tonight and to see this exhibition that has already been at a couple other venues here at this place, which will always be a special place for me. But my job tonight is to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brendan Foley, who has a very long and distinguished CV. He asked me to keep the introduction short, and I'm sure the images and the talk that he's going to give us will be more interesting than what I have to say, but I can tell you he is a native New Englander who grew up in Massachusetts and earned his bachelor's degree at the University of New Hampshire. So it is a cold night, but that's not unusual for Brendan, I suppose. He also holds master's degrees from Tufts University and the University of Southampton, and a PhD in the history and archaeology of technology from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And for many years now, Brendan has been working at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution in Massachusetts, and also on a number of very, very interesting underwater excavations in Greece. And tonight's lecture will tell us a lot more about one of the most famous of these, his work on the Antikythera Shipwreck in Greece. Some of you may have heard about this shipwreck, which was initially excavated more than a century ago, and yielded some of the most spectacular and really interesting objects that you can see in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. And Brendan has been working on this recently and has even gained attention in the popular media. So you may have heard about him via the Smithsonian or the BBC or the New York Times. He's been very much in the news, and I look forward to hearing his lecture tonight. So please join me in welcoming Brendan Foley.
Thanks very much. Good afternoon. Thank you, Kathy. Thank you, Seth. It's a delight to be here back in New Hampshire. I feel like I'm a little bit of culture shock because I live in Sweden nowadays. So being back here in New England and in America is, well, feels like a homecoming. So I'm delighted to be here, and thanks for coming out tonight. I thought what we would do is spend about 40 minutes talking about the Antikythera Shipwreck and some of the technology we've been using to bring to bear for archaeology underwater. I sit in the Deep Submergence Laboratory at Woods Hole Oceanographic, HUI as we call it. The Deep Submergence Laboratory and the National Deep Submergence Facility at Woods Hole run the deep submergence vehicle systems for the world scientists. We can operate at any water depth, down to the Challenger Deep in the Marianas Trench at a little bit more than 10,000 meters. We have robotic systems, we have human-occupied vehicles, we have a whole suite of very advanced sensors, and what we do is extract information from the oceans. Now, I'm the only archaeologist that's ever been employed at Woods Hole Oceanographic, even though we have a long and storied past of investigations of shipwrecks. For instance, Bob Ballard, who founded the Deep Submergence Lab, discovered Titanic back in the 1980s. He went on to look at Bismarck and a whole bunch of lost American and Soviet naval assets sitting on the deep sea floor, which doesn't get a whole lot of press. A lot of that work is still sort of black. But the technologies that were developed originally during the Cold War and that were then transferred over to scientific users are now available for the social sciences and humanities, for archaeology. And what this means is that the entire seafloor and everything on it is now accessible to us. And the Mediterranean seafloor in particular is a vast repository of human history. The biggest library, the biggest museum gallery in the whole world. And with these technologies, we have the key. We'll be the first ones in. It's that sense every day of Carter opening Tut's tomb. The seafloor is full of amazing things, even things that we cannot imagine. So I'll show you a little bit. One of the technologies we've used most recently is depicted here in the lower left. It's called the Exosuit. It's a semi-robotic system. A person gets in it, and it can go down to 1,000 feet and stay all day and come back up, and the person inside pays no decompression penalty the way that a normal scuba diver would. So an interesting piece of kit. It's actually owned by a construction company in Massachusetts, and its original job was to work on the aqueducts of New York City and the sewer outfalls in Boston. But it's been now loaned to us to use in Greece, and we're learning to crawl with it, learning to walk with it, we hope. And in the coming years, we think that this is going to be a way to get archaeologists down on the Antikythera shipwreck to start, but then many other shipwrecks down to 1,000 meters and put trained eyes on the archaeology without having to worry about the safety of the human. So, a bigger picture, instead of just one shipwreck, civilization, the modern world starts here in the Eastern Mediterranean during the Bronze Age, the end of the Stone Age, about 3000 BC. And that big blue expanse there that you see isn't a barrier to communication between the early cultures, the early civilizations, like the Egyptians there on the Nile Delta, like the people up in Anatolia. It was actually the biggest, freest highway that you can imagine. In the ancient past, before there were roads, before there were armies and police forces maintaining order, before there were airliners, certainly, the fastest, safest, most efficient way to move anything, certainly bulk goods, luxury items, people, and ideas, was by sea across that big blue expanse. So sailing was relatively safe, but not perfectly safe. So some fractional percentage of all sailing voyages in the ancient past, and even today, end in wrecking events. It's how ships die. So if you were Poseidon sitting on the abyssal plain of the Mediterranean over the millennia, there'd be this constant traffic overhead, swarms of traffic, mostly seasonal, pulsing. And every once in a while, Poseidon will reach up with his trident and poke a ship, and these raindrops fall down onto the seafloor. These raindrops are shipwrecks. What they really are packets of information. You can think of a shipping voyage as an ancient telephone call. The remains, the physical remains of those ancient telephone calls are the artifacts from the shipwreck, and our technology now allows us to eavesdrop on those ancient conversations. So if we want to understand the origins of civilization, one way to do it is to look at the shipwrecks that sit on the deep Mediterranean seafloor. Now, with the technologies we have, we can begin to think about surveying the entire seafloor of the Mediterranean. You know about the Malaysian airliner that went down recently, and before that, the Air France flight out of Brazil, Air France 447. Air France 447 went down in the middle of the Atlantic in an underwater mountain range, about 5,000 meters deep, over 15,000 feet deep. A group from Woods Hole and others went down, and using our autonomous robots, we surveyed the area until we found the wreckage, ground truthed our sonar data with video imagery, and led the recovery team to get the black boxes. The effort that it took to do that can now be applied to archaeology. And with that same sort of performance metric that we had on Air France 447, in 1 month, we could survey 1% of the Aegean seafloor and find every shipwreck on it. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole lot, 1% in a month. But if you think about the areas of the Mediterranean, the Aegean, that are likely to hold shipwrecks, and you eliminate the area that's been trawl fished, you eliminate the area that's been buried by sediment coming in from rivers or ash from the Theran eruption in the Bronze Age, you're down to maybe 25 or 30% of the seafloor that's archaeologically interesting. So what we're saying is that a 2-year or 3-year continuous effort would allow us to map every archaeologically interesting bit of seafloor in the Aegean. Why is that interesting? The shipwrecks represent a different kind of data, different kind of resource than we would find on land archaeology sites. Things are preserved on the ancient seafloor that typically don't get preserved on land sites. So the most photogenic example are the bronze statues which populate the National Archaeological Museum in Athens. All of these came from sites underwater. Most of the great bronzes that we have from the classical and Hellenistic world were recovered from shipwrecks or recovered from sites underwater. So that's one example of the kind of thing, the kind of information, the kind of artifact that gets preserved underwater that you don't see on land sites. But there are many, many others, and one of them is ancient DNA from the trade goods that were being carried on these ships. We can now extract ancient DNA from the transport jars on these shipwrecks and get hard data about what was being manufactured and traded in the first complex economies. So this is why we go into the deep seafloor. And by my estimations, there should be a shipwreck about every 3 square nautical miles on the seafloor out there in the Med. They're not all created equally. Some shipwrecks are more important than others. And there's no better example of a really important, fabulous shipwreck than the one that's off the island of Antikythera. The wreck dates to about 60 BC, and it was discovered in 1900 by some sponge fishermen from the island of Symi. They had sailed along the north coast of Crete to pick up one of their sponge fishermen, and as they were turning the corner to go into the Mediterranean to sail over to Tunisia, the winds came up, and they had to put into Antikythera Island for a few days. So here you see their kaiki, and it's a very blurry image. It's a glass plate negative image, of course, but you can maybe make out a man standing in the middle with the brass diving helmet, the bronze helmet. So just by chance, they dropped over the side to see if there were any sponges down below, and the diver pulled on his communication line. Emergency, pulled me up right away. So the men on the deck hauled him back up, and he came up, got the helmet off, and started shouting and ranting about landing on a pile of rotting corpses, naked women, and horses down below. So the captain of the vessel took his turn in the diving suit, wanted to go down and see what this was all about. And here you see Captain Kontos with his family. And when he came up from his short dive, he was holding a bronze arm and hand. And they were not corpses, they were bronze statues that they had landed on. And just by chance, more than 100 years ago, these sponge divers landed upon the richest ancient shipwreck that's ever been found. So what else was aboard this ship? The sponge fishermen continued their voyage on down to Tunisia. They fished for the season, and then when they came back to the Aegean, they reported their find to the authorities in Athens. Now, they were from Symi, which was still under the control of the Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire. But they were fiercely proud of their Hellenic traditions. They were Greeks through and through. So reporting back to Athens that they had found Greek antiquities on the seafloor, the Greek government then got quite excited. They detailed Greek Navy ships to go down and help them, and they paid the men to salvage the antiquities off the wreck. So what did they find? Well, they found many, many things. This was a huge shipwreck. They brought up amphoras, which are sort of the 55-gallon drum of antiquity. These are the standard shipping container for anything liquid or semi-liquid, carried all sorts of foodstuffs. Often they're associated with wine, although our ancient DNA work is showing that the vast majority of contents of these jars was not wine at all. So 1st century BC jars from all over the Eastern Mediterranean world and the Adriatic. Also these small perfume jars, unguentaria, which would have contained unguents, ointments, medicines, possibly cosmetics, and perfumes. These are rarely found on shipwrecks, and an indication that this is a high-value cargo with an elite, elite market in mind. And then these beautiful glass bowls, mosaic bowls, produced again in the Eastern Mediterranean in what's now Syria and Lebanon. The one in the upper left, the mosaic bowl, we had known about these. We'd seen them from tombs and other archaeological sites, but all of those were at least 100 or even 200 years later. So the discovery of this mosaic bowl on the Antikythera Shipwreck pushes the known origins of the manufacture of this type of artwork back by at least a century. There were coins, all sorts of coins, from Asia Minor, from the cities along what is now Turkey. The biggest hoard of coins from Asia Minor ever found outside of Asia Minor, and jewelry, many associated with women. So these earrings and the gemstones, many of them came from the same area of the shipwreck. Some of these were recovered in 1900, 1901, but some were also recovered by Jacques Cousteau in 1976, who was the last person who was allowed by the Greek government to dive on the shipwreck before us. But the most amazing thing that came off the shipwreck was the so-called Antikythera mechanism. And this has been billed as the world's first computer. It's not really a computer because it wasn't programmable in the way that modern computers are. What it was a collection of maybe 70 gears, differential gears, all put together in a way so that if you turned one main drive handle, it rotated these gears, and on the faces, on the front and back of this mechanism, indicator needles would spin. It showed the positions of the 5 known planets. It showed the phases of the moon on one face. On the back side, 2 interlocking spirals predicted forward and backward in time the likelihood of lunar and solar eclipses. There were other dials on it that predicted, that showed the timing of 4 of the major ceremonial games, the Olympic Games, the Nemean Games, and 2 others. And if that weren't amazing enough, it's also the first known object with an owner's manual. So in script about 2 millimeters high, in Greek script, there's these inscriptions that tell you how to operate the machine and what the needles will indicate. A fabulous thing, and anachronistic by at least 15 centuries. There's nothing as complex as this again until the clockwork mechanisms of medieval Europe. A fabulous thing. Here's one representation of what it may have looked like, an exploded view. The great thing about the mechanism is it's so complex that it could not have been a one-off. No genius, no lone genius could have sat down at his workbench and made this thing out of bronze plates with hand-cut gears in one go. It has to be somewhere on a continuum of technological development. It's the only example we've ever found. It's the only site that we know that's ever produced anything like this. And the site has never been scientifically investigated. So that's where we come in with the new technologies and the ability to go down and very precisely map this site and excavate it. Other things that came off the shipwreck, 4 marble horses, life-size marble horses. Almost certainly they were associated with a chariot, which could have had a statue of a warrior in it, or possibly even Athena Promarchus, Athena the warrior. So here's the crew on that Greek Navy ship in 1901, and you can see in the sling there, they've just recovered one of these horses. They recovered all four. Three of them are in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens right now. The fourth one, however, just as it got up to the surface, the rigging slipped and the horse plunged back down into the depths. They said it was bottomless, but we know it couldn't have been any deeper than about 150, 160 meters, because we've thoroughly mapped the entire coast of the island now. So we're hoping in coming seasons we might be able to relocate this fourth horse and reunite him with the rest of his team. Statues, 36 marble statues. Here's a wrestler. The right side of him is still shiny and perfectly preserved because he was embedded in the sediments. His left side was up in the water column, and the limestone of the marble has been badly eroded by the action of the sea. Most of the marbles that came off this site are badly eroded because they were mostly proud of the sediments, standing up into the water column. On the left, Odysseus. Now we know what these statues represent because there are Roman copies that are extant. But the statues that came off the Antikythera shipwreck are all either Hellenistic or classical. They date from the 1st century BC right back through the 4th century BC. And even in their badly eroded state, I think that they're somehow even more evocative than they may have been in their original beautiful form. And this striding figure speaks to me. I think it's more human than even it would have been coming out of the sculptor's workshop. In 1953, one of my personal heroes, Doc Edgerton, the famous electrical engineering professor from MIT, joined Jacques Cousteau on Calypso, and they went to Antikythera for about a day and a half. They relocated the site because Cousteau wanted to go and see if there were more antiquities. When they got back to Athens, they toured through the outside courtyard holding space at the museum, and these are many of the statues from the Antikythera shipwreck. The best ones are now inside, being exhibited in the gallery. Actually, many of them are on their way to Basel for an exhibition. But even now, several of these statues are still housed outside, now under a roof, but still in an outdoor courtyard. We were able to see them this past year. Human remains. There are at least 4 individuals represented by skeletal remains and teeth coming from this shipwreck. There may be more represented than that. Very, very rare to find human remains on ancient shipwrecks. In fact, this is the only wreck that I'm familiar with that has so many human remains. This skull has been interpreted as the skull of a woman, and it was recovered in '76 by the Cousteau team, and it came from a location 2 meters away from where those fabulous gold Cupid-studded, jewel-studded earrings were found, along with some of the other unguentaria and things associated with females. And this leads to the speculation, which we have no proof of, that perhaps it was some elite woman sailing with her dowry off to be married in Rome. We can't prove it, but it's a nice romantic story. And then the bronzes. So the ephebe, the Antikythera youth, greater than life size, stands over 6 feet tall, and now on exhibit in the National Archaeological Museum. It could be Paris, holding the apple of strife, which ultimately launched the Trojan War. It could be Perseus, holding the head of the Gorgon Medusa. We don't know, but one of the most impressive, most fabulous statues from the ancient world still extant. The head of the Philosopher. He wasn't anywhere near as intact as the youth, but we have his arm, we have his hand, part of his tunic, and this beautiful, rugged face. But that's not it. We have these hints, we have these suggestions that there's far more down there waiting under the sediments. We start counting up the feet and the hands and the arms and the accoutrements from other statues, and there are 6 or 8 other life-size bronze statues almost certainly still waiting in the sediments for recovery. These are interesting, these fragmentary pieces of the bronzes. It was suggested in the 1960s by an American archaeologist, Peter Throckmorton, that maybe the sponge fishermen weren't so proud of their Greek heritage. Maybe they didn't report everything to the Greek authorities. Maybe they recovered some of these bronze statues, and instead of going down to Tunisia to sponge fish, they dashed across to Alexandria and sold these life-size bronzes into the open market. But none of them have ever come up, and it's been more than 100 years. You would think that statues like this would have changed hands. So we don't know. We don't know for sure if the sponge fisherman did pilfer anything. What Throckmorton had said was, well, there's no other metal that's come up from the wreck. For instance, we would think that a big ship like this would have had many, many lead anchors. And of course, the sponge fishermen always needed lead to weight themselves down onto the seafloor. So the fact that we haven't found any lead anchors leads me to believe that the sponge fishermen took those lead anchors and maybe some other things. So we had this in the back of our minds, Throckmorton's words, when we went back to the shipwreck. So keep that in mind. Here's the arm and hand of a boxer. And of course, there's the fabulous statue of the boxer that's usually on display in Rome, which I think is right now on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Is it possible that we could find a boxer down there to complement the one that's now in the Met? And of course, swords. There are at least 2 swords, and there's the crest from a warrior's headdress that have been recovered. So again, that warrior, or possibly Athena, still resting on the seafloor. So what did we do? This past season we went back, and our first goal, scientifically, must do, is make a very, very precise map of the seafloor. So the way we went about that was to bring a robot, an autonomous underwater vehicle, an unmanned system, made by one of my colleagues, Oscar Pizarro here. He and I went through MIT together. He now works down in Sydney, in Australia. The robot carries a stereo pair camera, and with Oscar's engineering skill, it employs an algorithm called simultaneous localization and mapping, SLAM. So it takes pictures as it mows the lawn over the wreck site in a very precise pattern, and it pieces all those images together into a 3-dimensional photo mosaic and map of the site that's hyper-precise. Each pixel in the resulting map is 4 millimeters in real space. So what that means is, over the entire wreck site, we can place any artifact that we recover, and we can really understand the orientation of the wreck site and the artifacts within it. So here you see the robot busily over the wreck site, running its survey pattern. There are no artifacts to be seen. The sponge divers did such a good job in 1901, they really did us a favor. They took all the big bulky stuff like those statues and got them out of our way. So what's left is the natural rocks of the seafloor and a relatively flat sedimented blanket which sits on an uplifted seismic terrace. The depth here is close to 200 feet deep. It's over 50 meters, 52, 55 meters. You saw the vessel that the robot was launched from. That was generously provided. It's a yacht provided by one of our Greek sponsors, Panos Laskaridis. So the Ekaterini Laskaridis Foundation contributed that vessel for us. It was really quite generous of him. When he's not using the ship himself, he charters it for somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 euro per week, and he gave it to us for the month. At one point during the survey, the robot went over the edge of this uplifted terrace, a very steep vertical drop, and it's, of course, trying to maintain an altitude, a constant altitude. So it went over this edge down into deeper water, and as it turned around and tried to come back up, it got hooked on a piece of ghost fishing line. So that's what you're looking at here. I got a call, I was on shore this day. Brendan, the robot's trapped. Can we rig a technical diver to go down and save it? So we started getting tanks filled with the proper mixed breathing gas to go down and save it. But the Australian team had brought a small robot, and they were able to deploy that, and that's what you're seeing here with its little manipulator. And they were able to unhook it from the line and save the day. And there was much rejoicing. There's the vessel Glados. I put the Australian team as a 3-man team of engineers, and I put them in cabins on the yacht. And there was a lovely Filipino crew that kept coming up and saying, Mr. Oscar, Mr. Oscar, Mr. Stefan, would you like a coffee? Would you like a glass of wine? And the engineering technician, Christian Lees, who's a terrific guy, he settled into the yacht living lifestyle. I didn't think we were going to be able to get him off the ship. It's really funny. The most important thing for us, the absolutely critical thing, was to map the wreck site, at least as we understood it. So that's how we dedicated our first days of the survey. We had pretty nice weather those first days. But as you saw there, the weather started coming up. It got pretty stormy. What you're looking at here is the end result, the data product. This is the map. We're zooming out now. It's a 70 by 30 meter area that we surveyed to that hyper precision. That meant that we could put it on the big screen in the yacht's salon and all look at it together and analyze it with the divers, with the archaeologists, with the engineers, the technicians. Everyone had a much better understanding of the site because we don't have much time at 200 feet depth to mess about. So having this sort of map allows us to plan our strategy very, very well. We took what we knew from the Cousteau expedition in 1976, where the artifacts were recovered. We started placing them on our map. We printed our map out wall size. We were able to take a memory stick and put it on another sponsor's helicopter and zip it off of our remote island and get it up to Athens and have it printed out on this thick plastic material. And then the next day, back on the ferry, back to Antikythera. So within about 24 hours, we had this stuff printed up and on our wall. I'm not sure we would have been able to do that if we were in downtown Manhattan. And somehow we were able to do it in one of the most remote places I've ever worked. I mentioned that the weather wasn't so good. I'll show you a little bit about that in a second. But first, we'll have a closer look at this map and the power of it. You can see the scale here. It shifts as we zoom in and out. And on the far right-hand side of the screen, you've got a depth scale, which will come into focus right here. So you can eliminate the photos, if you want, and get down to the underlying bathymetry. You can even see the texture of the rocks. So if archaeology is absolutely concerned with the spatial relationships between artifacts, then I feel pretty confident that this sort of mapping capability allows us to do actual science. We can have repeatable results. And we can do this successively as we get into excavation. We can have a virtual excavation in the computer where we can go back and forth in time, refill our trenches virtually with the computer data. And this was all done in about 4 days of survey with the robot and a couple more days of data processing time after that. So the weather started getting rough, to coin a phrase. We knew that the storm was going to come in. We had the historical records, and we've worked on this island 2 years before, so we knew that it was going to get rough. It's really difficult to determine from this kind of imagery how big the waves are unless you've got something to give you a sense of scale. So to give you a sense of scale, this is a person. The winds blew hurricane force day after day after day. It was so loud that it was keeping us up at night because it was whistling through all the nooks and crannies on the rocks and in the buildings on shore in Antikythera. We had scheduled something like 28 days to be on site on the island. We ended up with 5 diveable days. So what did we do in those 5 days? We made the most of it. With the kind of team that we had, which included Phil Short, who's one of the world's most extreme divers. He was featured in an article in the New Yorker last year for his work cave diving in a huge complex in Mexico. Alexandros Sotiriou, who's one of the premier divers, comes from an elite diving family in Greece. I knew we only needed 1 good day. With the mapping, we had located an anchor stock, a lead anchor stock. And here's Phil recovering that now from a depth of 52 meters. So that notion that Peter Throckmorton had that the sponge divers had taken the lead anchor stocks off the wreck proved untrue. So we recovered one there. We actually had recovered another lead anchor stock just a few hundred feet away in 2012. This is a good day, the ship bouncing like that. metal detectors on site for the first time, so we can pinpoint our efforts underwater. When the sponge divers were here in 1900, 1901, their dives lasted about 8 minutes, of which 2 minutes was on the bottom, maybe 3. When Cousteau was there, their bottom time was about 10 minutes because they had scuba technology. With our closed-circuit rebreathers, we had an hour and a half on the bottom. And we were able to really spend some time looking at the site. Those 2 artifacts you just saw recovered are elements of an ornate bed. Other pieces of it had been recovered in 1901 and 1976. And here's the ultimate. It's a 2.1 meter long, almost 7 foot tall bronze spear. It's a statue element. And it was under the sediments. We hand fanned after a metal detection hit, and this came right up. It was at the very southern extremity of our map. So the wreck, as we understood it when we got out to the site, actually wasn't positioned as we thought. So instead of us surveying over the main cargo hold of the wreck, we were shifted somewhat toward the stern, toward the passenger compartments possibly. So it's pretty clear that if we go back, when we go back this year, we need to shift our effort, remap a much greater area to the south of where we recovered these artifacts, because we got metal detection hits all over the seafloor. It's unexpected. That's pretty fabulous. This is my colleague Theotokos Theodolou, who's the co-PI, works for the effort of underwater antiquities for the Ministry of Culture and Sport, and is one of the nicest human beings on this planet. He's just a terrific guy. This is Alexandros Sotiriou there on the lower right, and that's Phil Short, our chief diver, diving operations manager. That bronze ring that you see, it's one of the rigging elements of the ship itself. So running rigging would have been run through that loop. So not only do we have statue elements, we've got parts of the ship itself, including those anchors, and of course the ornate bed components, which we think probably came from a passenger compartment in the stern of the ship. We recovered this other anchor, collar, and stock in 2012. And here's how it works here. It's basically a gravity anchor. So about a 200 kilogram, about a 450 pound chunk of lead in that stock, and another 75 or 80 pounds of lead in the collar. This is about the standard size. We've seen these on other shipwrecks. About 1.4 meters long, 4 foot long, a little bit more than 4 feet long for the stock. And the collar, 80 centimeters, so what's that, about 2 feet 10 inches long. And here's a depiction of that. So try to remember those measurements I just gave you. Here's a 3D representation. And this is courtesy of Autodesk. Reality Captures the software. Autodesk provided a whole suite of their software to us at no cost to help us document the artifacts and the wreck itself. And speaking of sponsors, you might have noticed throughout the name Hublot and possibly the very large dive watches that were on the team. Hublot is a luxury Swiss watchmaker that sponsored the exhibit of the Antikythera Shipwreck at the National Archaeological Museum. And they were kind enough to jump in and sponsor our program too. And the helicopter came in one day and we met the Director of Research and Development, Matthias Boutet, on the back deck of GLaDOS. And he had this big bag with him. And as the divers came in off their dive for the day, he presented each of our dive team with a $30,000 Hublot watch to keep. So I tried to take credit for that. Hey guys, there's your bonus for the project. And we had a lot of happy divers. They're a large piece of titanium and depth rated to 4,000 meters. So someone said, you can go to 4,000 meters? Once. Once. So back to the story of these lead anchors. On the last dive of the last day, Phil and Alexandros and our two videographers and photographers underwater team swam down to the southern extremity of the site where we knew that there were more artifacts concentrated. And Alexandros, who's got a great eye, saw just a little bit of lead under all sorts of concretion. So he took his dive knife and started scraping away. And he scraped away what he thought at first was another anchor stock. but it turned out to be an anchor collar. And this anchor collar is more than a meter long, so more than 20% larger than the one we'd recovered before, and in fact is the largest I've ever heard of. So if the collar is a meter long, the stock must have been massive. And this starts to feed into some other information we have about this wreck. What was the ship itself like? By the end of the project, we were up to 5 lead anchors all over the site. So this notion that Throckmorton had that these had been pilfered by the divers is completely incorrect. It's just that no one's had the time and the technology to locate them before. So it feeds into our notion of these other bronze statues being down on the seafloor. But the lead is significant, important, because we can do isotopic analysis and try to determine the geographical location of the mines that produce the lead. We don't know what that's going to tell us yet. And ground tackle, anchors, can be picked up in any port. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the ship came from the same place as the source of the lead. However, this ship was sheathed in lead, the hull under the waterline, sort of an analog to bottom paint, but very thin, just a few millimeters thick, lead sheathing coated the hull of this. And there's bits of this hull sheathing lead all over the seafloor. And we collected a couple of pieces of that. Now, in 1976, the Calypso team, the Cousteau divers, had excavated a bit, dredged, really. They hadn't done it so scientifically, but we'll forgive them. It was 1976. And they uncovered 4 articulated hull planks, still joined together. And they brought these up, and they were conserved, and then they were sent off to the Effort of Underwater Antiquities storeroom for artifacts out on the Ionian coast at Pylos. One of my colleagues in the effort, Yorgos Koutsoflakis, remembered this, and he went out to Pylos, and he brought the planks back. And I was sitting talking with him at the effort over the spring last year, and he said, curious thing about these planks, the nailing pattern for the hull sheathing indicates that the hull sheathing was put on at the time of first construction. And that's significant because it means that if we can identify the source of that lead, it probably will mean that we can determine where the ship came from. He said, but there's something else that's even more interesting than that. These planks are huge. They're massive. They're more than 10 centimeters thick. They're 4 inches thick. Now, that's about the thickness of the hull planks on USS Constitution down in Boston. So massively, massively constructed. All of this starts to add up. And you think, what kind of ship would have been carrying a cargo that's so spectacular? These fabulous statues. What kind of ship would have had the cargo capacity? And what sort of merchant or important person, what kind of ship would that person have chartered to bring this stuff back to Rome if that's where it was going? And the one that pops up to mind is the ancient grain carriers. Now, we have written sources that refer to 2 of these, the Syracusa and the Isis. And these were not cargo ships like we think of cargo ships today. They really are more like Titanic. They really are more like the luxury liner of the time. They were the mechanism. They were the machine that allowed Rome to have the first population greater than 1 million people. They were sailing these ships from Rome down to Alexandria or into the Black Sea and bringing back massive cargoes, more than 1,000 tons of grain to provide the bread that went with the circuses. So in these written sources, they talk about these ships having mosaic floors, having a library, having passenger compartments that were exquisite with these incredibly ornate beds, like the components that we've seen. They had fish tanks on board, these huge freshwater fish tanks to keep their food ready to eat. Stables for 21 horses on these ships. And the passengers, you might have 200 or 300 passengers on board these ships. So massive, something like 170 feet long. There weren't ships this size again until the medieval period or even later. It's possible that what we're looking at here at Antikythera is the remains of an ancient grain ship. Now, again, you think about a cargo like statues, these beautiful bronzes, these marbles in their poses. You have a high bulk, low weight, very fragile cargo. How do you pack that? In modern day, we build a crate for it and fill it with bubble wrap or styrofoam or something. You couldn't do that in the ancient world. Maybe you'd have a crate, but then you'd still need to have a whole lot of weight to ballast the ship properly. So some of the historians and archaeologists have suggested that maybe these statues were packed in sand, and that's what kept them from shifting around too much. What if you packed them in grain? Then you'd have a paying dunnage. So we've taken sediment samples from 5 different points around the wreck, and we hope that we'll find ancient grain samples, seeds, in that sediment and prove that maybe this is how it moved. On this other southern end of the site, we found lead pipes, which are certainly associated with the water removal system. So either scupper pipes or part of the bilge pump mechanism. And again, isotopic analysis. And this is the kind of thing that would have been installed at the time of original construction. So it gives us more data points. Here's that bronze ring, a 3D representation of it from the running rigging. And I'm not sure yet. And this is new to me. I don't know what we can do with the bronzes. But I've contacted University College London and a laboratory in Switzerland, and we're going to throw everything we can, all the resources we can, and extract every single bit and byte of scientific information from every artifact we recover from this shipwreck. The wreck is so important, it deserves our full attention. And amphoras. Of course, we did recover a few amphoras from the wreck site. This is a Lambolia II, which has been associated with southern Italy, but now it looks like possibly they were produced in what is Croatia. So here we are with our trophy on the transom. That's Ed O'Brien, the diving safety officer from Woods Hole, sitting next to me there. And again, we can use the new technique that we've developed to extract, even from an empty amphora, trace ancient DNA and determine what the contents were. A Laganos, a table jug. This is the 49th Laganos that's come off of the ship. Again, that speaks to a contingent of elite passengers. These typically weren't used to transport goods. They were too fragile. They broke too easily. This would have been to carry stuff that was consumed on board, probably not by the crew, who would have been a bunch of roughnecks, I suppose, but by the passengers. So ancient DNA analysis we'll conduct on this too, and try to figure out what was contained in it. And there's plenty more down there. This one was upside down in the sediments, very close to where the spear was recovered. And then again on the southern extremity of the site, tiers of amphoras, which look to me like they're still in their lading positions. And these are very, very close to the bilge pipe and the lead anchor. So it looks very much like the ship hit the cliff, hit the island, and started to break up. If it's one massive ship. It could also be 2 ships that were sailing in consort. They have the same, both of these locations, which are separated by about 2 football fields, carry the exact same types of ceramics. So we think it's either one ship or 2 vessels sailing in consort. You know, I love to set things up so that it's a win-win. If it's one massive ship, if it's a grain carrier, then archaeologically that's huge. If it's 2 ships sailing in consort that went down together, then we have instant comparanda, and that's a win also. So it's an exciting place to work. And here's the beautiful and talented Dr. Maria Hansen, who happens to be my wife, who's our molecular biologist, and she'll do the ancient DNA analysis. And we're based in Lund. She's a professor of molecular biology, actually environmental toxicology. The archaeological stuff is just a lark she does on the side. And then one more video. The Greek government, in a nice echo of 1900, put in resources. You see here the helicopter of one of our other sponsors, Achilleas Konstantakopoulos from Costa Navarino. He provided his executive helicopter for us, which was pretty heady stuff, actually, and hugely, hugely important because Antikythera is so remote. So we were able to fly in our scientific team, fly them in and out, get our VIPs, get the media there, and it really worked well. We had a component failure on the robot. We were able to order a new part and have it helicoptered in, so we only had one down day instead of being out of the water forever. I mentioned the Greek government in that nice echo. They provided Hellenic Navy support. So you see the ship Thetis here arriving. It's a little bit of an elderly ship, but it worked for our purposes. And they even detailed a tugboat to help position the vessel. What we wanted to do was 3-point moor, there's the tug, the ship Thetis right over the wreck site because the exosuit, that technology, required a support ship of this size to deploy safely. So with the weather as nasty as it was, the ship had to hole up in the Peloponnese for more than a week, for about 10 days. And the Chief of Naval Operations of the Hellenic Navy was kind enough to keep extending for us the window of opportunity to get the ship down there until finally, we just waited for the weather to break. Poseidon was not so kind to it, even though we made an offering. And finally, we got the ship at least close to the wreck site. Now, we never expected that the exosuit was going to allow us to excavate perfectly in the first time. It was the first time it had ever been in the ocean. First time it had ever been deployed off a ship. So it was baby steps. We wanted to practice the evolution of launch and recovery, get a Greek into the exosuit, a Greek Navy diver. There's GLaDOS plowing through the seas. Some of our media arriving with Panos. We actually put Panos Laskarides, who's 72 years old, into the exosuit and let him do a quick dive, which was excellent for his ego and for public relations. And it also proves the point that almost anyone can, with a little bit of training, can get in there. So the first deployment of exosuit, here's Ed from Woods Hole deploying. We put the suit down beyond 200 feet just to test it out. And the owner of exosuit, who had come out and we treated with a great deal of kindness, offered us the suit for the next 5 years at no cost. So now we'll really be able to develop the capability. Just getting down to the very last couple of slides, we'll show you a little bit of the Exosuit Evolution. For all the political problems in Greece, I have to say that there's nowhere in the world I'd rather work. There's a reason I work in Greece. The Greek Navy was unbelievably supportive. They provided their combat swimmers, their Navy SEALs, as our diving support team, which is a pretty good feeling to know that someone that capable is watching your back. You saw the watch. We put another watch on Exosuit. Yeah. It looks so futuristic. It looks like something that Robert Downey Jr. would wear in a Hollywood movie. It looks like Iron Man. When you get into it, it feels like you're Lancelot in a suit of armor from the medieval period. But we think it's going to be a real asset for us in the future. It has thrusters that you control with your feet. So you're sort of straddling a bicycle seat, resting your feet lightly on these gimbaled foot pads. And that allows you to thrust forward and backward, twist left, twist right, go up, down. You can maneuver some. Yeah, there's our watch again. We have to keep the sponsors happy. It's very generous of them to support us. We couldn't do it without the sponsors. So. It's more like spacewalking than diving. I'll leave you with a closing thought. The Antikythera Shipwreck is spectacular. But by the most conservative estimates, if you just start thinking about what might be out there, what has to be out there on the deep sea floor, easily 750,000 shipwrecks from the ancient period, from antiquity. We've discovered far less than 1%. So what else is out there? And that's the thought that wakes me up at night and gets me out of bed every morning. We've got this vast playground, and I get to be, and the team that I am fortunate enough to work with, we get to be the pioneers. We're the first ones out there to see. But we hope that the next generation that comes along is inspired by what we've done. We hope that the galleries will be full of things that fill us all with joy, and that there'll be many, many other archaeologists and engineers and mathematicians and computer scientists and everything else coming along behind us to explore the deep sea floor and rediscover the origins of civilization. So thank you for your attention. If there's any questions, I'd be happy to entertain them.
So if anybody has a question, I have a microphone for you. Questions? Okay.
Here's one. Someone to break the ice.
Pass that down to him. Thanks.
What kind of visibilities were you seeing when you were underwater there?
About 200 feet.
Wow.
Yeah. In the images of the exosuit, you can read the hull numbers off the ship, even though the exosuit's down about 150, 160 feet. It's stunning. I actually measured the visibility the first time we went to Antikythera in June 2012. I brought a Secchi disc, and from the surface, lowering it down, we had 32 meters of visibility. And horizontally, when you're at depth, it's even greater.
What will be the eventual home of the antiquities that you recover?
Well, that's a good question. It'll be certainly a museum in Greece. And there's always a little bit of jockeying among the different divisions of the Ministry of Culture. The right place for them to be, in my mind, is probably in the National Archaeological Museum. But there's a movement underway right now to create a museum specifically geared toward maritime archaeology. So that could be another good home for it. And I'm really hoping that with the interest in the Antikythera mechanism and the Antikythera Shipwreck exhibit that's now traveling from Athens to Basel and then eventually on to Washington, D.C. and elsewhere, that if we make the discoveries that we anticipate, there'll be a traveling exhibition. I can tell you one place they probably won't end up, ever, in the British Museum.
This technology is fabulous. Is there anything else out there that you know about that you're wanting to get to use for this?
Well, the Navy U.S. Navy once lent us a nuclear submarine, and that was pretty good. I'd like to get that back. But the NR-1's been retired, and I'm not sure they're going to give me the Jimmy Carter, but it would be nice. On these projects, obviously, this is archaeology as big science. It stands to reason. You know, I sit at the Oceanographic Institution, and all of the other scientific fields command project budgets that are well into the millions of dollars. You know, our research vessel, NOR, our new vessel, the Neil Armstrong, charters for about $50,000 per day. So ocean science is big science, and it's got big budgets. I don't see any reason why good archaeological science also shouldn't command the same kinds of budgets. So on all of these projects, I say to the team, okay guys, think big. You know, tell me how you think we ought to do this. And don't let cost be an object. Give me what you would do in your grandest vision. And one of the things that came back from the technical divers was we ought to consider doing saturation diving, having a habitat installed at a certain depth on Antikythera, underwater. And then instead of worrying about an hour, hour and a half of bottom time and 2 hours of decompression for every dive, instead we could put divers into the habitat, put the habitat on the seafloor, and they could work 8-hour days. So I don't know what the price tag would be for that, probably something around $4 million, but it's something to consider. It would be lovely to have. It would really increase our efficiency, although I'm not sure how you graph out efficiency per dollar cost. I've been laughed at some conferences before when people say, it's so expensive, and I say, it doesn't matter how much it costs. It only matters that you can raise it. The money, I mean, not the artifacts. If it's worth doing, it's worth doing.
Is there any indication that the ship may have been anchored there, since you found the anchor spotted around, rather than driven ashore by a storm or bad navigation?
I'd say it's absolutely impossible that it was anchored. We had Thetis make 7 attempts to try to anchor over the wreck site, and that's a ship with a diesel engine and a tugboat, and we couldn't anchor the ship at all there. So in my mind, there's no doubt that it piled up, I think, at night in a terrific gale. Why do I think at night? Well, the fact that there are human remains on the ship, to me, means that they were below decks and didn't see the wrecking event coming. So I think that's the most likely scenario.
Do you know the sites of any famous naval battles, ancient naval battles? Are they known?
There's a site that's being investigated right now from the Second Punic War off the Agadi Islands near Sicily. And a colleague of mine, Jeff Royal from RPM Nautical, has been working with Sebastiano Tusa, who's the archaeological superintendente of Sicily. And they've been mapping out the battlefield from this tremendous, epic battle between the Carthaginians and the Romans. And what they're finding is the bronze rams from these warships, both Carthaginian and Roman. And I don't know what the count is now. They've got more than a dozen of these bronze rams, and it's really it's a battlefield landscape that they're mapping out. It's fabulous. I saw Jeff last week at the AIA conference in New Orleans, and I was just chortling. I was like, oh my God, your work is so exciting. It was like this mutual admiration society between us. I want to come on your project. No, I want to come on your project. So that's the one ancient battlefield site underwater that's having a lot of attention paid to it now. There are others. There's Lepanto, and I spoke with another archaeologist about possibly doing some survey there and seeing what might lie on the seafloor out there.
I have a question, Brendan. So when you're doing archaeology on land, you have trenches and you're measuring everything out and you know where you are at any given time. When your divers go down, do they know exactly where they're landing? And if they find something, how do you end up mapping exactly where you found it?
A bunch of different ways. We typically will print out on Mylar the site plan, and just like land archaeology, we'll denote a grid square where we want them to work, where we want us to work. But with the mapping, with the precise mapping, we really know where everything is. We know where everybody is. And because the robots are really, really good at repetitive tasks, I mean, it's what they're made for. And it's not what humans are made for. So one of my gripes about archaeology has always been we spend so much of our time and effort. We've got these trained people with these supercomputers in their skulls, and what are they doing? They're holding a tape measure and writing down numbers. It's mind-numbingly boring. And that's how we survey sites in shallow water, typically. With the robots, we can just eliminate that. So we send our divers, or send our team to a specific grid square. We excavate there just like you would do on land. And then we run the robot over again and map everything. We can do it so quickly, especially if you're over just a small 1 by 1 meter grid square. You don't even need the robot. You can just take your stereo pair camera and snap pictures every few minutes as you're excavating. So in a lot of ways, archaeology underwater is somewhat easier, and in a lot of other ways it's a lot harder. So it's win some and lose some.
Do you have a way to integrate the metal detection device with the location so you can actually get readings of, the pings that you're getting with the metal detection? And,
yeah.
And then do you have any sense of like where that's distributed in the wreck and that there are things down there besides the, I know you believe that there are things down there besides the anchors, yeah. But do you have a lot of evidence that, hey, this is a really good place to look next time?
That's exactly the next step. So I've been talking with Oscar and Steph, and at the end of the project, we were all so enthused and so excited. We're like, let's get back out there as quick as we can. Because Hublot had already said that they were in, and some of my private sponsors here in the United States, foundations and individuals, had already committed to funding for the field season. So Oscar and Steph, we were talking about 2 different sensing modalities that would be new. One was sub-bottom profiling sonar, so we could actually get a fairly good picture down through the sediments into the bedrock. And the second was precision metal detection. So we started looking around for what kind of sensors would be available off the shelf so that we could bolt these things on as quickly as we could, integrate the sensors into our data stream for the vehicles. And we found a system, and we think that we can modify it so that we'll get amplitude, and then we'll have that really good map, and we can integrate that into the nav stream that we've got. So we should be able to overlay that metal detection map with the amplitude so we get the hot spots. We're hoping. But then Oscar and Steph emailed me last week, and they're like, yeah, about May. That's coming real quick. How about July? I was like, well, if we have to, we have to. Yeah, we're not turning a spade of sediment down there until we've got those kinds of maps. So the nice thing about a ship that's been down there for over 2,000 years is it can wait another 6 months.